What's up, everyone? Today I wanted to dive into this tweet because specifically this is an argument I've seen time and time again. Now, I've spoken with Cody, who is the guy who tweeted this, and we actually have a podcast with each other. And so if you want to check it out, you're more than welcome to on his podcast. And he's a great dude, and he has all the right to be arguing this specific argument. But let me first explain why arguing this argument doesn't really make much sense, because what he's arguing is actually already false. So let me explain. I don't want to say false. That's a strong word. An over-extrapolation. But let me explain, because you need to go to the origin story of where this original graph came from. And this is where we have some hiccups in research and application. Because sometimes to apply things, you oversimplify it. And when you oversimplify it, you actually miss the meaning of it. So let me lay down the premise first of what Cody's arguing. And then let me talk about the origin here. So Cody's like, look, you have a force velocity curve, and it's commonly accepted that you should train movements across the force velocity curve. And that's okay. But he said, look, you need to do other things to get faster too, because when you run fast, like moving 10 meters a second, you are moving at a really high speed and lots of things are going on, and that's really important to do for training. But in his argument, he is saying that whatever is happening in these specific strength zones doesn't fall within the specific strength zone of sprinting because the velocity is different. But this is where the origin story is really important, because we have one movement, the sprint, being argued against very much a non-contextualized range of velocities and percentages. And those range and velocities and percentages are actually derived from other studies based off this origin story, but let me walk you through the history of it so we can draw some clarity to this. So the original kind of history of this, we'll go through it quickly, is A.V. Hill back in the day had a frog muscle, and he measured, it was actually the sartorius of the frog muscle, measured the contraction velocity based on the heat it dissipated and so on and so forth. And long story short, he found out that there's a parabolic curve. And what happens is at high velocities, you don't produce as much force, and at lower velocities, you produce more force. So that was in an isolated muscle study. Then they went on to say, look, well, does this happen in kind of single joint movements? When you have a heavy load, are you able to, produce more force? And when you have a lighter load, are you able to move fast but not produce as much force? And the research corroborated this and said, yeah, look, it confirmed it. Yeah, cool. That is kind of the case. And when you extrapolate that even further, people go, well, if that's the case in single joint movements, is that the case in multi-joint movements? And they did that with like squats and stuff like that. And they found out, well, it's not necessarily this curve. It's more like this linear line. All right. So what happens here is we've extrapolated 3 levels: isolated muscle study, single joint, and then a dynamic movement. In all 3 of these cases, the movement being tested, whether it's the muscle, isolated fiber, or up to the more kind of complex movement, has 2 things going on. As we get more complex, more muscles are involved, but there are primary movers, and those primary movers are moving in what's called an acyclic manner. They don't start with an impact. They're not building up velocity to it. There's not repeated movements. It's one single movement. And secondly, it's looking at the movement velocity as a relationship to the contraction velocity, because there are only one primary mover for the most part. Right, in the isolated knee extension, you could say like the quadriceps. And in the squat, you could say the quadriceps plus some other muscles. But maybe that's why it's linear and not parabolic curve like you've seen the other ones. But the point is, it's this extrapolation that we get to, and eventually like, look, when we sprint, movement velocity is way higher than that of any of these other movement velocities that we can get when we're lifting, jumping, or whatever we're doing. And the reason is twofold. 1, you actually built momentum into it. It's acyclic. But number 2, that's center of mass velocity, not contraction velocity. Now, what happened is the researchers said, look, we have an isolated muscle. We can do a single joint and then a multi-joint, and we can kind of roughly draw a line. And each extrapolation, the precision gets worse and worse, but roughly draw a line between the original contraction velocity, and if I know if it's a single joint movement, then movement velocity is kind of like a contraction velocity because there's only certain muscles working, and then a multi-joint movement, it's another step out. But then we do an acyclic dynamic movement like sprinting, and we then assume that that is movement velocity. That movement velocity is directly related to contraction velocity. Research says otherwise. First off, there's lots of muscles responsible for that movement, not just kind of one primary mover. And two, in that movement, they've shown that things like your soleus actually don't contract that fast at all. It contracts in your isometric. They even argue that the hamstrings are acting near isometrically as well. So it's very interesting when we start to get extrapolated out further and further. Paavo Komi elucidated a lot of these findings in his research when he used ultrasound imaging in real time in the gastroc and the soleus, as well as the Achilles, to look at muscle tendon dynamics during dynamic movement. And it found out that when we do these kind of dynamic movements, the way the muscle contraction stuff operates is very different than in an isolated setting. So when we extrapolate this out further and further, we have two issues. One, the dynamics of the movement are totally different. But number two, we're looking at center of mass velocity, not contraction velocity. As I just told you guys, the center of mass velocity is going to differ quite a bit from the actual muscle contraction velocity. So we're actually arguing apples to oranges here versus apples to apples. And that's why it gets really confusing. It's because we've extrapolated out the original research, and the original research is never really discussed nor talked about. And so when we just see the propagation of this extrapolated research and saying, if we just do movements in these specific ranges because the movement velocity is that fast, well, we might be trading specific qualities. That has a level of incorrectness to it. Now, that level of incorrectness is natural because that is coming from the extrapolated attempt to make it applicable, but still it is incorrect. And there's a level of incorrectness with it. And so as we keep getting further and further out, these arguments start to actually not make sense because we get away from the origin of the research itself. And that's so important. So I invite you guys to check out the original work. I invite you to check out Cody's podcast as well. It's awesome. It's a great listen. This is no ding on anybody here. It's just a very good example of how things can get really confusing when we talk about research and application, because a lot of times the original thread gets lost, and that original thread holds all the context as to what we're actually looking at in the first place and where is it appropriate to be applicable and extrapolated to. Because if you knew the origin story of this kind of research, then you would know that these kind of large extrapolated out recommendations have a little bit of grain of salt with them, and they're like, well, it's not perfect, but I get the idea. But then to argue an imperfect already extrapolation is going to lead mass confusion, because now we're just arguing two things that really don't even come from the original source that the research came from. So I wanted to share that with you guys today. I hope that makes sense. I appreciate you guys listening. And as always, thank you, and hope you guys enjoyed.